Why are you sitting alone like that? Evelyn flinched slightly. Her eyes remained fixed on the painting in her hands. Behind her, the small voice spoke again. Hello? Soft footsteps approached across the floor. Evelyn didn't turn. My name is Annie, the girl continued brightly. Annie Brooks. There was a short pause. I'm 6 years old, she added proudly. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the paper. The same age Lily had been just before her last birthday. Annie leaned a little closer, trying to see Evelyn's face. My mommy works in the kitchen, the girl explained casually. She says I have to stay downstairs and be quiet. A small shrug followed, but the house was really quiet already. Still no answer. Annie waited. Then she continued politely. What's your name? Evelyn remained silent. The garden wind rustled the rose bushes outside. Annie tilted her head. It would be really nice if we knew each other's names, she said thoughtfully. Don't you think? It's kind of hard to talk to someone if you don't know what to call them. No reply, but Annie wasn't discouraged. Her attention drifted down to the picture Evelyn held. Oh, she said softly. That's a drawing. She stepped closer. Before Evelyn could react, a breeze slipped through the open window and lifted the corner of the paper. Oh, wait! Annie quickly grabbed the drawing before it could fall. Evelyn turned sharply. For the first time, her eyes focused on the little girl. Her lips parted slightly. The sound of a word almost formed, but it stopped. I'm sorry, Annie said quickly, handing the paper back. I didn't mean to grab it. She studied the drawing carefully. That's really good. Her finger pointed at the small stick figure. Did your daughter draw it? Evelyn slowly took the paper back. Annie looked around the room curiously. The sunroom was large and elegant, but it felt strangely untouched, like a room that had once been full of life and laughter but had been frozen in time. A piano stood in the corner. Dust rested lightly on its lid. Annie wandered toward a small table and picked up a pencil. Oh, she said suddenly, I can draw too. She climbed onto the bench and placed a sheet of paper in front of her. Let me try to copy it. Her small hand began scratching lines across the page. The result was not impressive. The house leaned sideways. The sun looked lumpy. The stick figures had arms that stretched like spaghetti. Annie squinted at it. She looked back at Evelyn. So your daughter's name was Lila? Evelyn's eyes flickered. Annie kept drawing. Or maybe Lulu. She added another crooked line. Or Liddy? The pencil scratched again. Evelyn's breathing changed slightly. Annie leaned closer to the original drawing. Oh, wait, she said thoughtfully. Maybe it says Lily. She nodded. That's a pretty name. Then she held up her messy drawing proudly. See? It looked nothing like the original. But I think I can do better, Annie added cheerfully. My teacher says drawing just takes practice. She paused, studying Evelyn carefully. You know something funny? Annie continued. I'm 6 years old. She held up 6 small fingers. That's the same age as your daughter, right? Evelyn's hands trembled. Annie didn't notice. She was still examining her crooked picture. Well, my son looks like a potato, Annie admitted. And these people look kind of weird. She pointed at the stick figure she had drawn. This one is supposed to be your daughter. She frowned. But she doesn't look right. Annie glanced back at Evelyn. Maybe you should tell me how she looked. Silence filled the room. Annie waited. Then she tried once more. Her name was Lily, right? The answer escaped before Evelyn could stop it. Yes. The word was barely louder than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Annie froze. Slowly, her eyes lifted. You talked. Evelyn stared at the drawing in her hands. Her voice felt strange, fragile, like something that had been buried too long underground. Across the sunroom, Annie's face slowly brightened. Lily, the girl repeated softly. Then she smiled. That's a beautiful name. Outside, the Whitmore garden swayed gently in the wind. Inside the mansion, the silence that had ruled the house for an entire year had finally cracked. And it had happened because a 6-year-old girl named Annie Brooks had simply introduced herself. For a moment, neither of them moved. Evelyn sat with Lily's drawing in both hands, her eyes fixed on the crayon sun in the corner of the page. Across from her, Annie stood very still, as if afraid a sudden movement might scare the word away. Then, with all the reverence of a child who had just discovered something holy, Annie smiled. Lily, she repeated softly. That's prettier than Lila. The corner of Annie's mouth lifted in quiet satisfaction, as if she had solved an important puzzle. Then she looked down at her own crooked drawing and wrinkled her nose. I did a terrible job, she announced. My son still looks like a potato. Evelyn's lips trembled. Not quite a smile. Not yet, but something close. Annie noticed that too. My teacher says if you mess up, you're supposed to try again, she went on, sliding back onto the window bench. She says quitting is what makes bad drawings stay bad. She picked up the pencil once more and began sketching with deep concentration, her small tongue pressing against the corner of her mouth. Evelyn watched despite herself. The child drew exactly the way children did everything else, with complete faith that effort mattered more than skill. Outside, the late autumn light shifted across the gardens. A gardener in a green jacket crossed the far path with pruning shears in one hand. The fountain at the center of the lawn whispered steadily into the quiet afternoon. Inside the sunroom, Annie drew another lopsided house, then another, then one with a roof so crooked it looked as if it might slide off the page. Nope, Annie muttered. That one's worse. Evelyn lowered her gaze to Lily's original drawing. The paper had softened at the folds. She could still remember the afternoon Lily had made it, sitting at the long breakfast table with a pink box of crayons spread everywhere, refusing to let anyone help. Don't fix it, Mommy, she had said. I want it to look like mine. Evelyn shut her eyes. The memory came with unbearable clarity. Lily's yellow cardigan, the little crease between her brows when she concentrated, the stubborn sweetness in her voice. When Evelyn opened her eyes again, Annie was watching her. Did she like drawing a lot? Annie asked. The question was simple, gentle. There was no pity in it, no professional patience, no carefully rehearsed therapeutic tone, just honest curiosity. Evelyn's throat worked. The sound stopped. Annie did not rush to fill the silence. She what? The girl asked after a moment, in the same tone she might have used to ask how cookies were made. Evelyn looked at the yellow ribbon tied to the music stand across the room. She loved yellow, she whispered. The sentence came out broken and rusted from disuse. But it was a sentence. Annie's eyes widened again. She did? Evelyn nodded once. The movement felt enormous. Annie turned to look at the ribbon, then back at the drawing in Evelyn's hands. That makes sense, she said seriously. Yellow is a happy color. The innocence of the remark hit Evelyn harder than condolences ever had. Happy color. As if the world were still simple enough to assign safety to shades of sunlight. Before she could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Quick, adult, purposeful. Maria Brooks appeared in the doorway, already apologizing before she stepped inside. Annie, what did I tell you about wandering off? She said, in a hushed, strained voice. Then she saw the scene before her and stopped cold. Her daughter was on the bench with a pencil in her hand. Evelyn Whitmore was sitting upright in the chair, not staring through the window but looking directly at Annie. There was color in Evelyn's face, faint but undeniable, and in the room, where there had been silence for a year, there was the unmistakable feeling that something had shifted. Maria's expression changed from irritation to alarm. Annie, she repeated, lower this time. I was just talking, Annie said, and drawing bad houses. Maria crossed the room quickly and took the pencil from her daughter's hand. I am so sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, she said, not quite meeting Evelyn's eyes. She knows she isn't supposed to come upstairs. Evelyn looked at the woman. Maria had worked in this house for years. She had always been kind, always efficient, and unlike some of the others, she had never treated Evelyn's grief like a spectacle. In the hospital, after Lily died, Maria had been the one who quietly folded Eleanor's coat and set it over a chair. The one who placed untouched coffee beside Richard at dawn. The one who understood that sorrow often required presence more than speech. Now Maria seemed frightened. It's okay, Evelyn said. The room froze. Maria blinked. Annie turned so fast she nearly slipped off the bench. Mrs. Whitmore's voice had been soft, but it had been clear. If this moment touched your heart, please take a second to like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your message helps build a community of listeners who believe in kindness, memory, and quiet acts of love. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. For one long second, the three of them simply stared at one another. Then Annie grinned as if the sun itself had stepped into the room. She talked again, she announced. Maria put a hand over her mouth. Oh, my lord. The words came out in a whisper. Evelyn lowered her eyes at once, as though ashamed of being caught. Her hands tightened around Lily's drawing. She could feel the old panic rising now. The instinct to retreat. To crawl back behind the wall she had lived inside for 12 months. 2 words. That was already too many. Too much hope could be dangerous. Hope made people expect things. Maria seemed to understand. Her voice softened. Mrs. Whitmore, you don't have to say anything else. But Annie, who knew nothing of the rules adults built around pain, climbed down from the bench and walked to Evelyn's chair. I think Lily would like the yellow ribbon, she said. And I think she'd laugh at my potato son. Evelyn looked up. Annie's face was open, earnest, utterly sure of what she believed. My grandma says people we love don't leave all at once, the girl continued. She says they leave little pieces of themselves everywhere, in houses, in songs, in gardens, in ribbons. The fountain murmured outside. Somewhere downstairs, a phone rang and stopped. Maria stood silent at the doorway, one hand pressed to her chest. Evelyn drew in a slow breath. Then, before fear could stop her, she said, she tied it herself. Annie's whole body lit up. The ribbon? Evelyn nodded. On the piano. The words were still halting, but they were words. More than the doctors had gotten. More than Richard had heard in a year. More, perhaps, than Evelyn herself had believed remained in her. Annie smiled with the solemn pride of a child entrusted with something precious. Then we shouldn't move it, she said. Not ever. Evelyn looked at the ribbon again. It felt like evidence. Proof that Lily had been here. Proof that joy had once lived in this room. Proof that silence, however long it ruled a house, could not erase love. Maria stepped back into the hall, already glancing over her shoulder as if wondering whether she ought to call Mr. Whitmore immediately. But before she did, Evelyn lifted her gaze and spoke one more time. Let her stay. Maria stared. Annie did too, though her smile came faster. Yes, ma'am, Maria said softly. And in the fading light of the Whitmore gardens, with a child's messy drawing still lying on the bench and Lily's picture held close against her heart, Evelyn Whitmore listened as the silence around her loosened for the very first time. Richard Whitmore received the news in the middle of a conference call with San Francisco. He had one hand braced against the edge of his desk and the other pressed to a set of quarterly projections glowing on the screen before him when a soft knock sounded at the study door. He almost ignored it. People rarely interrupted him during calls unless something had gone badly wrong. Then he looked up and saw Maria Brooks standing there. Even from across the room, she looked shaken. Richard muted the call. Yes? Maria stepped inside, then stopped as if unsure whether she ought to speak at all. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. Mrs. Whitmore spoke. For a moment, he simply stared at her. The silence that followed felt stranger than any silence in the house had felt in months. What did you say? Maria swallowed. She spoke, sir, in the sunroom, to Annie. Richard pushed back from his desk so quickly his chair rolled into the bookshelf behind him. No, he said, not harshly, but with the stunned disbelief of a man afraid to trust his own hope. No, you must have misheard. Maria shook her head. I heard her myself. He stared at her face, searching for uncertainty, exaggeration, confusion. There was none. What did she say? The first word was Lily, Maria answered. Then she said the ribbon on the piano. Lily tied it herself, and before that, she told me to let Annie stay. Richard's throat tightened. He looked past Maria toward the hallway, toward the staircase, as if he might somehow see the impossible from where he stood. For a year, people had brought him reports, medical terms, specialist opinions, strategies, prescriptions, theories. They spoke of trauma and neurological retreat and complicated grief. Some assured him there would be progress if given time. Others, more careful, warned him that silence could settle into permanence. He had listened to them all. He had paid for the best of them. And still, every morning, he found his wife sitting by the garden window with the same emptiness in her eyes, as if all language had been buried with their daughter. Now Maria Brooks was standing in his study telling him that a 6-year-old girl had done in an afternoon what no expert in New York or Boston had managed in a year. Richard pressed a hand over his mouth. Is she still there? Maria nodded. With Annie. He turned away abruptly, perhaps to hide the emotion that had already risen too quickly in his face. He stared out the tall study windows at the west lawn, where bare branches were beginning to cast long evening shadows over the gravel paths. He remembered Evelyn standing there one spring morning in a straw hat, laughing because Lily had insisted on planting tulips in the wrong season. He remembered the sound of both their voices drifting through the open doors. He had not heard either sound in so long that memory itself felt dangerous. "Sir?" Maria asked gently. Richard straightened, though his composure was no longer complete. "Thank you," he said. "You did the right thing telling me." Maria hesitated. "I wasn't sure whether I should bring Annie back downstairs." Richard looked at her. "No," he said, after only a moment. "Not yet." Maria nodded once and quietly withdrew, closing the study door behind her. For several seconds, Richard remained still. On the laptop screen, charts and muted executives waited in tidy digital boxes for him to resume speaking. The whole machinery of his professional life remained poised and orderly, just as it always had. He reached forward and ended the call without a word. Then he left the study and made his way upstairs. The Whitmore mansion had become a place where even footsteps seemed to know when to soften. The staff moved carefully. Doors opened and shut quietly. Conversations rarely rose above a murmur. It was as though the entire house had learned to bend itself around Evelyn's silence. Richard climbed the staircase slowly, one hand resting on the banister polished smooth by years of family use. Halfway up, he paused. What if Maria was wrong? What if Evelyn had only made a sound, and hope, hungry as everyone in the house had become for change, had mistaken it for speech? Worse. What if he walked into the room and frightened whatever fragile thing had begun there? He stood still long enough to hear his own heartbeat. Then he continued down the hall. The door to the sunroom stood slightly open. Richard did not enter at once. He stopped just outside the threshold, hidden from view by the angle of the wall. Inside, the late afternoon light had thinned into the soft gold of early evening. It lay across the floorboards in long strips. The garden beyond the windows was slowly losing color as dusk approached. Roses, hedges, and stone paths seemed to recede into a quieter world. Evelyn sat in her chair near the window, but she did not look the way she had looked that morning. She was not turned entirely inward, not staring through the glass as though the garden were somewhere she could no longer reach. Her attention was directed toward the window bench, where Annie sat cross-legged with a notepad in her lap and a terrible second attempt at the drawing. The house was still. Then Annie held up the picture. "Okay," she said, studying it critically. "This one's better, but I think the cat looks sick." Richard blinked. There had never been a cat in Lily's original drawing. Evelyn's mouth moved. A soft sound emerged. "No cat." Richard gripped the doorframe so hard his knuckles whitened. Annie looked delighted. "Oh, right, no cat." She erased furiously with the side of her hand, making the paper smudge. "What about the sun? Does that one still look like a potato?" A pause. Then Evelyn said, "A little." The room tilted. Richard did not understand, in that moment, how a man could feel his heart break and mend at the same time. He had stood in hospital corridors. He had signed forms with steady hands while nurses avoided his eyes. He had delivered a eulogy with a voice so controlled that people called it brave. He had endured 12 months of silence from the woman he loved and had slowly taught himself not to expect anything more. And now she was discussing a child's drawing. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, Annie was laughing. "I knew it," she said. "It's because I make the middle too fat." Evelyn's lips curved. It was not a full smile, not even close. But it was the first movement Richard had seen there that did not belong to grief. His chest tightened so fiercely he had to step back once, just to breathe. The floor creaked. Both Annie and Evelyn turned. Richard froze in the doorway. For one suspended second, no one spoke. Annie was the first to recover. "Mr. Whitmore," she announced proudly. "Mrs. Whitmore says my son still looks like a potato." Richard looked at his wife. Evelyn's face changed the instant she saw him. Not into blankness, not fully, but a flicker of caution passed over it, as if she suddenly remembered how dangerous speech could be once others began expecting it. He saw that. And because he saw it, he entered the room with the same caution one might use approaching a wounded bird. He stopped several feet away. His voice, When it came, was so quiet it scarcely disturbed the room. Evelyn. She lowered her eyes. The old ache rushed through him, sharp and familiar. For a terrible second he thought the moment had already ended. Then Annie, unconcerned with the fragile rules of adult sorrow, hopped off the bench and tugged lightly at Richard's sleeve. She said Lily's name. The little girl whispered, though not quietly enough for whispering to matter. And she said, "I can stay." Richard nodded without taking his eyes off Evelyn. "I heard." Annie looked between them, sensing something solemn in the air. Perhaps for the first time that day, she fell silent. Richard took one slow step closer. "You don't have to say anything," he told Evelyn, and there was no command in it now, only tenderness. "I just wanted to see you." Evelyn's fingers tightened around Lily's drawing. Richard noticed it, then the creased paper, the faded crayon sun, the little figures holding hands. He remembered the day Lily had made it. She had run through the breakfast room waving the page and insisting it was going to hang in the kitchen because important art should be where people eat toast. He almost smiled. Instead, his eyes burned. "She carried that around all morning," he said softly, speaking now to the memory as much as to his wife. "Wouldn't let anyone touch it." Evelyn looked up. Their eyes met. The room seemed to narrow around that one fragile line of connection. Then, in a voice rough from disuse and grief, she said, "She hated the blue crayons." Richard stared at her. The sentence was small, almost absurd in its specificity. But that was what made it real. No therapist would have scripted it. No hopeful staff member could have imagined it. It was memory, alive and ordinary, stepping quietly back into the world. A sound escaped Richard, then not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. He turned his face away, ashamed perhaps of how unguarded the emotion was. But Annie had already seen it. "Are you crying?" she asked with blunt 6-year-old concern. Richard let out one breath that trembled on the way out. "A little," he admitted. Annie nodded, accepting this as perfectly reasonable. "My mommy says grown-ups cry because they wait too long." To Richard's astonishment, Evelyn made the faintest sound of agreement. It might once have become a laugh. He looked at her again, and this time he could not hide what was in his face. Hope. Raw, aching, terrified hope. "Would you like some tea?" he asked. Not because tea mattered, but because ordinary questions belonged to ordinary life, and ordinary life suddenly seemed possible again. Evelyn hesitated. Then she gave the smallest nod. Richard swallowed hard. "Okay," he said. "Tea." Annie climbed back onto the bench and held up her drawing once more. "And maybe I should get another piece of paper," she said. "This one still looks ridiculous." Richard smiled, then briefly, helplessly. "Yes," he said. "Maybe another piece of paper." He left the room a moment later, not because he wanted to, but because he needed the privacy of the hallway to gather himself. The corridor outside the sunroom was dim now, the walls lined with portraits of Whitmore's long dead, solemn men and women who had built fortunes and guarded reputations. None of them, he thought, knew the first thing about survival. He stood there alone, one hand pressed to his eyes, and let the tears come for only a few seconds before mastering himself again. When he looked back through the doorway, Annie was drawing. Evelyn was watching, and the silence in the room no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like something opening. The Whitmore mansion woke up differently the next morning. For a year, mornings in the house had moved slowly, like careful footsteps across thin ice. Staff members spoke softly. Doors closed gently. Even the kitchen seemed to whisper instead of bustle. But today, something subtle had changed. Not louder, not happier, just lighter. Maria Brooks noticed it first. She stood at the long wooden kitchen counter pouring coffee when the chef walked in carrying a tray of freshly baked biscuits. "You hear anything last night?" he asked quietly. Maria nodded. She spoke again. The chef froze. "You're serious?" Maria glanced toward the ceiling, where the upper floor stretched above them. She said 3 sentences, Maria said. The chef leaned against the counter slowly. "Well, I'll be." A dishwasher nearby stopped what he was doing. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Maria nodded again. "And the little girl?" the chef asked. Maria couldn't stop the faint smile that touched her mouth. "She's already asking if she can come back upstairs today." The chef chuckled softly. "Smart kid." Upstairs, morning light spilled across the Whitmore gardens, catching the frost still clinging to the hedges. Evelyn Whitmore stood at the sunroom window, not sitting, standing. The movement itself would have startled anyone who had watched her over the past year. For months she had barely left that chair, but now she stood quietly with her hands resting on the back of it, looking out over the garden paths where gardeners were already trimming rose branches for the winter. Her voice felt strange in her throat, like an instrument that had not been played in years. But the silence that once felt safe now felt different, not protective, lonely. She turned slowly and looked toward the piano. The yellow ribbon still hung from the music stand. Lily's ribbon. Her fingers brushed it gently. "Mommy, yellow is the happiest color." The memory came so clearly that Evelyn's breath caught. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she heard footsteps. Fast, light, excited. Annie Brooks burst into the room before Maria could stop her. "Good morning," the girl announced. Maria followed close behind. "Annie." But Evelyn raised a hand slightly. Maria stopped immediately. The room went quiet. Annie stood there holding a piece of paper and 3 crayons clutched tightly in her fist. "I brought supplies," she said proudly. Evelyn blinked. "Supplies?" The word felt awkward, leaving her mouth. But Annie grinned. "For drawing." She hurried to the bench and spread her tools across the surface like a professional artist setting up a studio. "I thought maybe we should try again." Maria remained near the doorway, watching carefully. Evelyn walked slowly to the bench and sat down. It was the first time she had sat somewhere other than the chair in a year. Annie noticed. "So," the little girl said seriously, "yesterday, we figured out 3 things." She held up 3 fingers. "First, your daughter's name was Lily." A pause. Evelyn nodded. "Second, my son still looks like a potato." Another pause. Evelyn's lips twitched. "And third," Annie said proudly, "you talked." Maria felt her chest tighten in the doorway. Annie handed Evelyn a crayon. "You can help this time." Evelyn stared at the crayon. "Yellow." "Of course." Her fingers hesitated. Then slowly she took it. The moment felt enormous. Annie began drawing again. The same crooked house. The same garden. But this time she added flowers everywhere. "Your garden is big," Annie explained. "And Lily probably liked flowers." Evelyn looked down at the page. "She liked tulips." The sentence came out rough, but clear. Annie's head snapped up. "Tulips." Evelyn nodded again. "In spring." Annie immediately began scribbling tulips across the paper. "Then we need lots." Maria pressed a hand against the doorframe. 2 sentences. 2 sentences in less than 5 minutes. Downstairs, the house had begun to move into its daily rhythm. But upstairs in the sunroom, something far more important was happening. Evelyn Whitmore was remembering how to live inside her own voice. Annie leaned back and studied the drawing. "Better," she declared. She turned the page around. "See?" The house was still crooked. The sun still looked strange. But now bright tulips filled the yard. Evelyn looked at it quietly. Then something unexpected happened. She laughed. It was small, soft, almost like a surprised breath. But it was unmistakably a laugh. Maria covered her mouth. Annie blinked. Then she laughed too. "What?" Annie asked. "The tulips are bigger than the house," Evelyn said. Annie looked down. "Oh," she shrugged. "That's because I like flowers." The 2 of them sat there looking at the ridiculous drawing. And for the first time since Lily Whitmore died, laughter existed in the Whitmore mansion again. At that exact moment, Richard Whitmore stepped into the hallway outside the sunroom. He had been halfway down the stairs when he heard it. The sound stopped him instantly. He stood very still, because he knew that sound. It was the sound he had not heard in a year. Evelyn laughing. Richard walked slowly toward the door. Inside the sunroom, he saw the scene unfold like something fragile and miraculous. Annie sitting cross-legged with crayons everywhere. Evelyn leaning forward with the yellow crayon still in her hand. A crooked drawing on the bench, and sunlight across the floor. Richard stayed in the doorway quietly. He did not interrupt. He simply watched. For the first time in a year, the Whitmore house did not feel like a place built to contain grief. It felt like a home again, and it had started with a 6-year-old girl who refused to let silence win. The Whitmore mansion had once been a place where mornings were scheduled like clockwork. At exactly 7:30, breakfast appeared in the dining room. At 8, Richard Whitmore usually left for the city. At 9, the household staff moved through the hallways, polishing floors, dusting shelves, and watering the plants that filled the enormous windows. But routines had broken apart the day Lily died. For an entire year, the house had lived without rhythm. until Annie Brooks began climbing the stairs every morning. On the third day after Evelyn spoke again, Annie arrived with a small pink backpack slung proudly over her shoulders. Maria tried to stop her halfway up the staircase. "Annie, slow down," she whispered. "I'm not slow," Annie replied. "I'm efficient." Maria said, "You're 6. Exactly. By the time Maria reached the top step, Annie had already slipped into the sunroom. "Good morning," she announced brightly. Evelyn Whitmore was already there, but she was not sitting in the same chair anymore. Instead, she stood near the window, arranging something carefully on the long wooden table. 3 cups, a small teapot, and a plate of biscuits the chef had sent upstairs. Annie's eyes widened. "Is that breakfast?" Evelyn turned. "Yes." The word came easier now. Not strong, not steady, but present. Annie hurried across the room and climbed onto the bench. "You made breakfast?" Evelyn shook her head slightly. "The kitchen." "Oh," Annie said. Then she leaned closer and whispered loudly, "That's good because my mommy says rich people kitchens are better than school cafeterias." Evelyn almost smiled. Maria stood quietly near the door again, observing. Every morning she expected the miracle to disappear. Every morning she expected Evelyn to retreat into silence again. But so far, Annie's presence had done something no therapy session had accomplished. It had made grief move. Annie pulled her pink backpack open. "I brought better supplies today," she said proudly. She dumped the contents onto the bench. Crayons, colored pencils, a thick sketch pad, even a pair of child-sized scissors. "Whoa," Maria muttered. Annie beamed. "My teacher says artists need tools." Evelyn sat beside her. "Artist?" Annie nodded seriously. "I'm training." Evelyn reached for the sketch pad slowly. "What are we drawing today?" Annie thought hard. Something important. She grabbed a pencil. A garden. Evelyn looked out the window. The Whitmore gardens stretched wide and peaceful under the morning sun. Frost from the night before had melted away, leaving the gravel paths bright and clean. "Okay," Evelyn said quietly. Annie began drawing immediately. First the house, then the fountain, then the flower beds. Her pencil moved fast. Evelyn watched with interest. "You forgot the oak tree," she said after a moment. Annie gasped. "You're right." She quickly added a very large, crooked tree. Maria felt her throat tighten. That was the third full sentence Evelyn had spoken that morning. Annie turned the sketchbook toward her. "How's that?" Evelyn studied it carefully. "The tree is too big." Annie shrugged. "I like big trees." Evelyn reached for a green pencil. "May I?" Annie nodded. Evelyn leaned forward and carefully added smaller leaves around the tree branches. Her hand trembled slightly, but the movement felt natural. For a year, her hands had done nothing but hold Lily's drawings. Now they were drawing again. Annie watched closely. "You're good at that." Evelyn paused. "My daughter taught me." The words slipped out before she could stop them. The air changed instantly. Annie didn't look uncomfortable. She simply nodded. "Lily?" Evelyn swallowed. "Yes." Annie continued drawing. "What was she like?" The question arrived gently, but it was still a door. Evelyn hesitated. Then she looked down at the paper. "She liked yellow." Annie smiled. "I remember." Then she colored the sun bright yellow again. "Did she like games?" Evelyn nodded. "Hide and seek." Annie's eyes lit up. "I'm really good at hide and seek." Maria smiled quietly. The conversation flowed slowly, but it flowed. Downstairs, Richard Whitmore sat in his study pretending to read emails. In truth, he had read the same message 4 times without understanding a single word. Because upstairs, something fragile and impossible was happening, and he could not stop thinking about it. Finally, he stood and walked toward the stairs. When he reached the sunroom door, he paused again. Inside, Annie was explaining something passionately. And then the cat jumped on the table. Evelyn blinked. "Cat? We don't actually have a cat," Annie admitted. "But I want one." Evelyn's shoulders moved. Richard realized it was another laugh. Soft, but real. He stepped inside. "Good morning." Annie waved. "Mr. Whitmore." Evelyn looked up. Her voice came slower when he was present, but it still came. "Good morning." Richard felt the words hit him like sunlight. He sat beside them quietly. Annie pushed the drawing toward him. "We're redesigning your garden." Richard studied the picture. The fountain looked like a volcano. The tulips were enormous, and the oak tree leaned sideways. "It's ambitious," he said. Annie grinned. "Art always is." Evelyn laughed again, and this time Richard laughed with her. For a moment, the grief that had frozen the Whitmore mansion loosened its grip. Not gone, never gone, but moving, slowly, carefully, like spring beginning under frozen ground. By the end of the week, Annie Brooks had become part of the Whitmore mansion in the same way morning light was part of the sunroom. She arrived with stories in her pockets, stories about school, about a classmate who ate glue in secret, about a squirrel in the church parking lot that she swore was judging people, about her teacher's shoes, which Annie believed were too shiny to be trustworthy. And every day, Evelyn Whitmore listened. At first, that had been all. Listening, a nod here, a quiet word there, a brief answer shaped with effort, as if each sentence had to pass through a gate that had rusted shut. But now the words came a little more easily. Not many, not fast, still fragile, still halting, but they came, and the house felt it. The staff moved differently now, not because anyone had announced a miracle, but because hope altered a room even when no one spoke of it. The chef sent fresh biscuits upstairs without being asked. The gardeners cut late roses and placed them in a small glass vase in the sunroom. Even Richard, who had spent a year walking around grief like a man circling a collapsed bridge, now lingered a few extra minutes at breakfast just to hear whether Evelyn might say one more thing. On Saturday morning, Annie arrived carrying a paper crown she had made from construction paper and tape. "It's for important occasions," she explained as Maria helped her out of her coat. "What important occasion?" Maria asked. Annie looked offended by the question. "Being alive," she said. Maria rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. "Lord help me." When Annie reached the sunroom, Evelyn was standing at the piano, not touching it, just standing beside it, one hand resting lightly on the polished wood, as if she had walked there without meaning to and was not yet sure whether she had the courage to go further. Annie stopped in the doorway. "Good morning." Evelyn turned. "Good morning." The words were soft, but steady. Annie grinned and put the paper crown on her own head. "You seem surprised," she said. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the crown. "A little." "It's for important occasions," Annie repeated. Evelyn nodded, almost solemnly. "What occasion?" Annie walked into the room and set her backpack on the bench. "Well," she said, "today feels like maybe something good might happen." The answer was so simple that Evelyn nearly smiled. Annie followed her gaze to the piano. "Did Lily play?" For a second, the old fear returned. Not because the question was cruel, because it was gentle. Gentleness was harder to survive than cruelty sometimes. Cruelty made walls easier to keep. Evelyn ran her fingertips over the closed lid. She tried. Annie stepped closer. "That means yes." Evelyn looked down. She knew 3 songs. Halfway, Annie laughed softly. "That's how I know most things." The child's easy humor settled something in Evelyn's chest. She opened the piano lid slowly. The keys looked almost too clean for something that had not been played in so long. Someone on the staff must have kept dusting them, preserving the appearance of normalcy in a house that had forgotten what normal meant. Annie climbed onto the bench and pressed one key. A clear note sounded, then another, then a third, all wrong together. Evelyn winced. Annie looked up. "That bad?" Evelyn nodded once. Annie looked pleased. "That means I have talent hiding somewhere." Richard, passing the hall outside, paused when he heard the piano. He did not enter this time. He simply stood beyond the open door, one hand in his pocket, listening. Inside, Annie scooted to make room on the bench. "Come on," she said. "You have to help." Evelyn hesitated. The bench, the keys, the ribbon tied to the music stand, the memory waiting beneath it all. Then she sat. Her movements were careful, deliberate, like those of someone returning to a church after a long absence. Annie put both hands flat on the keys and whispered, "I don't know anything." "That's clear," Evelyn said. The dry edge of the remark startled both of them. Annie blinked, then laughed with delight. That was a joke. Evelyn's mouth curved before she could stop it. Annie immediately pressed her advantage. "Do another one." "I'm out." "No, you're not. Grown-ups always keep more hidden." Evelyn shook her head. But the shaking came with warmth now, with life. Annie pressed a single middle C. "What did Lily play?" Evelyn looked at the key. She liked the easy songs. "What's an easy song?" "The kind children believe are hard." Annie considered that. That sounds like a grown-up answer. Richard smiled despite himself in the hallway. Evelyn lifted one finger and pressed a key, then another. A small sequence of notes followed, simple, hesitant, not really a melody at first, only memory finding its feet. Annie listened carefully. Again, she said. Evelyn played it again. This time Annie added one wrong note in the middle. Evelyn corrected her automatically. No, here. She moved Annie's finger slightly. The contact was brief, natural, unforced. Annie looked down at her hand, then back at the keyboard. You did that like my teacher. I used to teach her. The words came before Evelyn had time to fear them. Richard closed his eyes briefly in the hall. Used to. Not buried. Not erased. Used to. Annie turned on the bench. You taught Lily piano? Only a little. Was she good? Evelyn looked at the yellow ribbon. She was impatient. Annie nodded solemnly. That can still be good. For a while, they kept at it one note, then another. Annie getting half of them wrong and all of them with confidence. Then Annie's attention shifted, as it often did. Not from boredom, but from some sudden spark no adult could predict. She hopped off the bench and wandered to the bookshelf along the far wall. Most of the shelves held hardcovers on art, architecture, philanthropy, and old Whitmore family histories no child would willingly touch. But on the bottom shelf, tucked between a gardening book and a photo album, was a slim sketchbook with a yellow elastic band around it. Annie pulled it free. Can I see this? Evelyn's body went still. The sketchbook had belonged to Lily, not the one with the hospital drawings, an earlier one. Safer, perhaps, but still hers. Annie sensed the change in the room immediately. If it's private, I won't, she said. Evelyn looked at the sketchbook, then at Annie. Bring it. Annie carried it over carefully and placed it on the bench between them, as though setting down a sleeping bird. Evelyn opened it. Page after page held the wild certainty of a child's imagination. Flowers taller than people, a horse with blue eyelashes, a self-portrait in a yellow dress, Richard with a square jaw and 6 fingers on one hand, Evelyn wearing an absurdly large hat. Then halfway through, Annie stopped on one page and smiled. It was a garden drawing. The fountain, the path, the old oak tree, and on the lower right corner, a little girl in a yellow sweater holding a red balloon. Was this Lily? Annie asked. Evelyn nodded. She made her legs too long. Annie leaned in. Maybe she wanted to look older. Evelyn stared at the page. Maybe she had. Maybe she had known, in some child way, that time was not something to waste. Annie traced the red balloon in the air but did not touch the paper. She was pretty. Something in Evelyn's face changed then. Not a collapse. Not even quite sorrow. It was recognition, the painful, necessary kind, the kind that asked to be spoken aloud. She was, Evelyn said. Then after a moment, she was brave. The room went quiet. Annie looked at her with those serious brown eyes that always seemed older than 6. My mommy says brave doesn't mean people aren't scared, Annie said. It means they still stay. Evelyn lowered her eyes to Lily's drawing. The sentence moved through her slowly. Stay. For a year, she had mistaken silence for staying. She had believed that if she said nothing, moved little, wanted nothing, then she had not truly left her daughter behind. But sitting there on the piano bench, beside a 6-year-old child with a paper crown in her backpack and too much honesty in her voice, Evelyn felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in months. Not happiness. Not yet, but return. When Annie turned the page again, she found a drawing of 3 people in the garden under a bright yellow sun. The little figure in the middle wore a crooked crown. That one looks like me, Annie said. Evelyn let out a soft breath that almost became a laugh. It does. And from the hallway, unseen and grateful beyond measure, Richard stood listening as his wife's voice continued its slow, miraculous way back into the world. The sun rose slowly over the Whitmore Gardens the following Monday, spreading pale gold across the hedges and the gravel paths that curved through the estate like quiet rivers. For the first time in a year, the house woke up with anticipation. Not loud anticipation. Whitmore houses did nothing loudly, but something had shifted in the air. Maria Brooks noticed it when she stepped into the kitchen at 6:30 and found the chef already humming. You're in a good mood, she said. The chef shrugged while flipping pancakes. Hard not to be. Maria poured coffee into a white mug. Because she's talking? He nodded. Because the house sounds like a house again. Maria carried the mug toward the window and looked out over the gardens. Somewhere upstairs, Annie Brooks was probably already awake. The child had begun treating the Whitmore mansion like a second home. Every morning she woke early, convinced that something interesting might happen before breakfast. Maria took a sip of coffee. "And we're all praying it lasts," she said quietly. Upstairs, Annie was indeed awake. She had been awake for nearly 20 minutes, sitting cross-legged on the guest bed while carefully braiding the yellow ribbon she had borrowed from the piano the day before. Not permanently borrowed, just temporarily. She had plans. When Maria opened the door, Annie looked up proudly. "Good morning." Maria stared at the ribbon. "Where did you get that?" Annie held it up. "From the piano." Maria pressed a hand to her forehead. "Annie, I'm giving it back," Annie said quickly. "I just needed it for something important." "What important thing?" Annie hopped off the bed. "You'll see." Maria sighed, though she couldn't stop the small smile forming. "Put your shoes on." "Yes, ma'am." 10 minutes later, Annie burst into the sunroom carrying the ribbon like it was treasure. "Good morning." Evelyn Whitmore was already there, but today she wasn't standing by the window. She was sitting at the piano. The lid was open. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys. Annie froze in the doorway. "You're playing?" Evelyn looked up. "Trying." Annie tiptoed closer. "Did you break the piano yet?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not yet." Annie grinned. "That's impressive." Maria lingered near the doorway again, pretending to check the flowers on the side table while secretly watching every second. Evelyn played a few hesitant notes. Not a real song, just fragments, muscle memory waking slowly. Annie listened like a serious audience member. Then she remembered the ribbon. "Oh." She ran forward and placed it gently on the piano. "I borrowed this." Evelyn picked it up. "Why?" Annie held up the paper crown from her backpack. "I needed decoration." She carefully tied the ribbon around the crown. "There." She placed it on her own head. "Now it's official." Evelyn tilted her head. "Official?" "Yes." Annie sat on the piano bench beside her. "This room needs a queen." Evelyn blinked. "A queen?" Annie nodded solemnly. "You?" Maria covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Evelyn looked at the crown, then at Annie, then back at the piano. "I don't think queens play piano badly." Annie leaned closer. "Everyone plays badly at first." Evelyn looked at her. "That includes you." "Especially me." They both laughed softly. Outside, the gardeners pushed a wheelbarrow past the fountain. Inside, the piano began to fill the room again with quiet notes. For a while, Annie simply listened. Then she asked the question that had been sitting in her mind for days. What was Lily like? The keys stopped. Evelyn's hands rested motionless. The old pain rose quickly, like a shadow crossing sunlight. But this time she did not retreat from it. "She was curious," Evelyn said slowly. "Like you." Annie's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes." Annie leaned back proudly. "That makes sense." Evelyn smiled faintly. "She asked questions constantly." "Did she talk a lot?" Evelyn nodded. "All the time." Annie grinned. "That definitely sounds like me." Evelyn's gaze moved toward the garden. She liked the fountain. Annie turned toward the window. "The one outside?" "Yes." "Did she throw pennies in it?" Evelyn nodded again. She believed wishes worked. Annie considered that. "They do sometimes." Evelyn looked at her. "Sometimes? When people help them." The answer settled gently into the room. From the hallway, Richard Whitmore had paused again. He had been walking toward the study when he heard voices. Now he stood just beyond the door, listening. Evelyn's voice, still fragile, still careful, but present, and Annie's voice, fearless as always. Annie hopped off the bench suddenly. "Come on." Evelyn looked up. "Where?" "The fountain." Evelyn hesitated. For a year she had barely stepped outside. Grief had made the world feel enormous and dangerous. But Annie stood there with complete confidence. "We need coins," the girl said. "Why?" "For wishes." Evelyn almost said no. Instead, she stood. Maria's eyes widened. Annie grabbed Evelyn's hand. "Not pulling, just holding." "Let's go." Richard stepped quietly aside as the two of them walked into the hallway. He watched his wife walk past the place she had stopped for 12 months, past the stairs, toward the garden doors. For a moment he couldn't move. Then Maria whispered beside him, "She's going outside." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes, outside." The morning air was crisp. The gravel path crunched under Annie's shoes. She ran ahead to the fountain. "Okay." She turned dramatically. "Rules." Evelyn stepped closer. "What rules?" Annie held up one finger. "You have to believe the wish." Second finger. You can't tell anyone. Third finger. And it has to be kind. Evelyn studied the fountain. The water moved gently in the sunlight. She reached into her pocket and found a coin Richard had given her weeks earlier that she had never used. Annie threw hers first. Splash. I wished for a dog. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. That's kind? For me. Evelyn laughed softly. Then she tossed the coin. The water swallowed it instantly. Annie leaned forward. What did you wish? Evelyn looked at the ripples. The answer sat quietly in her chest. I wished, she said slowly, to keep going. Annie nodded. That's a good one. From the house behind them, Richard watched the two figures standing by the fountain. His wife, alive in the sunlight, and the little girl who had brought her back. For the first time in a year, the Whitmore estate did not feel like a place where life had stopped. It felt like something beginning again. Margaret Whitmore heard about the fountain before she saw it for herself. News traveled in the mansion the way scent traveled through old wood quietly, inevitably, impossible to contain. By noon, the staff knew Mrs. Whitmore had walked into the garden. By 1 o'clock, the chef had added fresh lemon bars to the afternoon tray, just in case upstairs wanted something sweet. By 2, the butler had already mentioned it to the driver in the low, respectful tone reserved for rare and meaningful events. And by 3, Margaret Whitmore arrived unannounced. Her black sedan pulled into the circular drive with the polished calm of old money. Nothing about Margaret's entrances was ever accidental. She stepped out wearing a camel wool coat, pearl earrings, and the expression of a woman who believed disorder was a personal insult. At 70, Margaret Whitmore carried her wealth the way some women carried perfume lightly, constantly, and with the expectation that everyone else would notice. Maria Brooks saw the car first from the kitchen window. Oh no, she muttered. The chef looked up from the stove. Mrs. Whitmore Sr.? Maria nodded once. Annie's upstairs. The chef's face tightened. No one in the house needed further explanation. Margaret Whitmore had never approved of blurring lines between family and staff. In her world, roles existed for a reason, and affection was a luxury best kept within class boundaries. Maria dried her hands quickly and headed for the stairs. Too late. Margaret had already entered the front hall, handing her gloves to the butler with a cool efficiency that managed to look gracious while feeling nothing like warmth. Where is Richard? She asked. In his study, ma'am. And Evelyn? The butler hesitated just slightly. In the sunroom. Margaret's gaze sharpened. Still, the butler chose caution. Mrs. Whitmore has been spending more time there. Yes. Margaret removed her coat. I see. Maria appeared at the end of the hall and lowered her head politely. Good afternoon, ma'am. Margaret glanced at her, then at the staircase. Your daughter is here today. Maria felt her stomach tighten. Yes, ma'am. There was no one to watch her after school. Margaret gave a single, slow nod, the kind that looked like acceptance if one did not know better. Try not to let her wander. Maria opened her mouth, but Margaret was already moving toward the stairs. Up in the sunroom, Annie sat cross-legged on the rug with a deck of oversized picture cards spread around her. She had invented a game that involved matching colors to emotions. According to Annie, yellow meant brave, blue meant sleepy, green meant polite, and red meant someone's probably about to get in trouble. Evelyn sat on the bench near the piano, watching with a quiet softness that had not existed on her face in a year. And this one, Annie declared, holding up a purple card with a rabbit on it, means confused. Evelyn tilted her head. Why? Because rabbits always look like they forgot something. Evelyn almost laughed. The sound of heels in the hallway stopped her. Not Richard. Not Maria. These steps were sharper, deliberate, familiar in a way that brought old tension with it. Margaret Whitmore appeared in the doorway. The temperature of the room seemed to drop. Annie looked up first. She had met Margaret only twice before, both times in passing, and had already decided she was the kind of grown-up who smiled without meaning it. Margaret's eyes moved across the room and landed on the child sitting at Evelyn's feet, then on the cards, then on Evelyn. For a brief moment, her composure flickered, not because she was pleased, because she was startled. Evelyn, she said. Evelyn straightened slightly, her hands folded together in her lap. Margaret stepped into the room, her gaze still resting on Annie. I was told you've been improving. The pause before the last word was small, but not kind. Annie rose to her feet. My name is Annie, she said before anyone else could speak. I'm 6. Margaret looked at her with mild surprise, as if furniture had introduced itself. That's very nice. Annie frowned a little, sensing dismissal even if she could not yet name it. Margaret turned back to Evelyn. You should have called me. Evelyn's throat tightened. For years, that voice had meant scrutiny, correction, advice dressed as concern. After Lily's death, Margaret had called every week during the first month, speaking gently in front of Richard and far less gently when they were alone. You mustn't surrender to this. People are already talking. The family cannot afford a spectacle of grief forever. You are not the only mother who has buried a child. Every sentence had felt like a hand pressing down on her chest. Now Margaret stood in the sunroom, looking at Annie as though the child herself were evidence of poor judgment. I didn't know I needed permission, Evelyn said. The room went still. Margaret blinked once. Annie's eyes widened. It was not just that Evelyn had spoken. It was what she had said. Margaret recovered quickly. You misunderstand me. No, Evelyn said, the word quieter now but steady. I don't. Down the hallway, Richard heard voices and rose from his desk at once. Back in the sunroom, Margaret drew a measured breath. I came because I was concerned. This house has lacked structure for months, and now I hear from half the county that some servant's child is running through it as if she belongs here. Maria, who had reached the doorway seconds too late, stopped cold. Annie turned to look at her mother, then back at Margaret. Some servant's child. Children often heard cruelty more clearly than adults because they did not yet know how often the world excused it as manners. Maria stepped forward. Ma'am, Annie can come downstairs. No, Evelyn said. All heads turned. Margaret's chin lifted slightly. Excuse me? Evelyn stood. It was not a dramatic movement. No grand gesture, no trembling outburst. But there was a dignity in it that made the entire room rearrange around her. Annie instinctively moved closer to the piano bench. Suddenly quiet. Evelyn looked first at Maria. Annie stays, then at Margaret. She has done more for this house in 1 week than judgment has done in a year. Margaret's face hardened. Evelyn, no. Evelyn's voice wavered, but only once. You do not get to come here and decide who belongs in my grief. Richard entered then, stopping just inside the doorway. His mother turned sharply. Richard. He took in the scene at a glance. Maria tense at the door, Annie standing very still. Evelyn upright and pale but holding her ground, his mother wrapped in indignation and certainty. What happened? He asked. Margaret answered first. What happened is that your wife appears to have forgotten the difference between kindness and impropriety. Richard's eyes moved to Evelyn. She did not look away. In the old days, before Lily's illness had consumed their lives, Richard had often let his mother's opinions pass uncontested. It had seemed easier, more efficient, less exhausting than challenging the old architecture of power inside his family. But grief had changed the value of many things. What impropriety? He asked calmly. Margaret gestured toward Annie as if that settled everything. This. Richard glanced at the child. Annie lifted her chin with surprising composure for 6 years old. Her little hands were clasped tightly in front of her. But she did not step back. He looked at his mother again. Annie is welcome here. Margaret stared. She is the maid's daughter. Maria flinched. Richard's voice cooled. She is a child. The silence that followed was not the old silence of mourning. It was something firmer. A line being drawn. Margaret looked from her son to Evelyn, perhaps expecting one of them to bend as they always had before. Neither did. Annie, who understood only half the conversation but all of the feeling, slipped her hand into Evelyn's. The gesture was small. It changed everything. Margaret saw it. So did Richard. And in that instant the truth became undeniable. This little girl had not simply interrupted the household's routine. She had entered its wound and brought warmth with her. Margaret gathered her gloves from the side table with stiff precision. I see I'm no longer needed, she said. Richard did not answer. Neither did Evelyn. Margaret turned and left the room without another word, her heels striking the hallway floor like small, hard verdicts. Only when she was gone did Maria let out the breath she had been holding. Annie looked up at Evelyn. Was she mad at me? Evelyn looked down at the child's hand in hers. No, she said softly. She was wrong. Maria's eyes filled before she could stop them. Richard stepped closer, looking at his wife with something like astonishment, and something deeper than that respect. Outside, the late light fell across the garden paths. across the fountain where yesterday a wish had been made, across the windows of the mansion that no longer seemed sealed shut by sorrow. Inside the sunroom, Annie picked up the purple rabbit card from the rug and held it up solemnly. "This," she declared, "is definitely still confused." Evelyn laughed then, not loudly, not for long, but enough to turn the room human again. And for the first time, the Whitmore mansion did not merely protect a fragile recovery, it defended it. The Whitmore mansion was quiet again that evening, but it was no longer the heavy silence that had filled the house for the past year. That silence had felt like thick fog pressing against every wall. This new quiet felt different, lighter, uncertain, almost like the pause between breaths. Margaret Whitmore's car had been gone for hours, but the tension she left behind still lingered in the hallways. Downstairs in the kitchen, Maria rinsed dishes slowly while Annie sat at the table swinging her legs. "Was I rude?" Annie asked. Maria dried her hands and turned. "Why would you think that?" The older lady looked like she swallowed a lemon. Maria almost laughed. "That's just the way Mrs. Whitmore looks at most people." Annie thought about that. "She didn't like me." Maria leaned against the counter. "Some people have trouble liking things they don't understand." Annie frowned. "I'm pretty easy to understand." Maria smiled gently. "Yes, you are." Upstairs, the sunroom windows had turned dark with evening. The garden lights outside glowed softly along the gravel paths, and the fountain shimmered like a small silver mirror under the lamps. Evelyn Whitmore sat quietly on the piano bench. Her hands rested on the closed lid. The house felt calm again. But inside her mind, something restless had begun moving. Speaking again had opened doors she had kept locked for 12 months. Memories were returning now, bright ones, painful ones, moments she had tried to bury beneath silence. She heard footsteps behind her. "Richard." He stepped into the room carrying 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might want something warm." Evelyn turned slightly. "Thank you." The words were still careful, as if each one had to be lifted from deep water, but they were no longer impossible. Richard placed 1 cup beside her. For a moment they simply sat together. The quiet between them was no longer empty. "I'm proud of you," he said gently. Evelyn stared down at the steam rising from her tea. "I didn't do anything. You came back." The sentence settled heavily in the room. Evelyn closed her eyes. "I didn't know how," she said. Richard nodded slowly. "Neither did I." That had been the part no one spoke about. While Evelyn had retreated into silence, Richard had buried himself in work. Meetings, contracts, long flights between cities. Everyone called him strong for it, but strength had simply been another form of hiding. He looked toward the piano. "I heard you playing earlier." Evelyn's mouth moved faintly. "It wasn't very good." "That's not what I meant." She understood. Neither of them had touched the piano since Lily died. Until today. Richard leaned back slightly in the chair. "You know," he said, "she used to think the fountain granted wishes." Evelyn nodded. "She told everyone." Richard smiled at the memory. "She threw pennies in it every day for 2 weeks. Evelyn's voice softened. "She wished for a horse, and a puppy, and a castle." Richard laughed quietly. "We almost had to build the castle." For a moment they both smiled. Then the sadness returned gently, like a tide that never fully left the shore. Richard looked toward the doorway. "That little girl," he said. "Annie." "Yes." He shook his head slightly. "I don't understand how she did it." Evelyn followed his gaze toward the hallway. "She didn't try." Richard looked at her. "She just talked." "And that worked?" Evelyn took a slow breath. Children don't wait for permission to care. Richard sat with that for a moment. Downstairs, Annie's laughter floated faintly through the stairwell. It was a bright, fearless sound. Evelyn listened to it. "I forgot what laughter sounded like in this house," she said. Richard studied her carefully. "You're not the only one." Silence returned again, but this time it felt comfortable. After a while, Evelyn reached toward the piano keys. Her fingers rested on them gently. "I keep hearing her," she whispered. Richard's expression softened. "Lily?" Evelyn nodded. "When Annie talks." Richard understood immediately. The same curiosity, the same fearless honesty. Children recognized each other across grief in ways adults never could. "Does it hurt?" he asked. Evelyn looked toward the yellow ribbon tied to the music stand. "Yes." Then she added quietly, "But it also helps." Richard let out a long breath. For a year, he had feared Evelyn might never return from the place grief had taken her. Now she was sitting beside him, speaking, remembering, feeling again. fragile, but alive. Outside, the fountain rippled softly in the garden, and upstairs in the sunroom, the Whitmore house continued its slow, impossible healing. After a while, Evelyn closed the piano lid. "We should thank Annie," Richard smiled. "I think we should do more than thank her." Evelyn looked at him. "What do you mean?" Richard leaned forward slightly. "I think she belongs here." Evelyn's eyes moved toward the doorway again. Downstairs, Annie's voice rose loudly. "Mom, I'm still not tired," Maria answered from the kitchen. "You will be in 5 minutes." Evelyn laughed softly again. Richard listened to the sound carefully, like someone hearing music after a long winter. For the first time in a year, the Whitmore mansion no longer felt like a monument to loss. It felt like a place where life was quietly finding its way back. The following morning arrived wrapped in silver light and the kind of stillness that only old houses seem to understand. A thin layer of frost rested across the Whitmore gardens, making every hedge and rose branch sparkle beneath the pale Connecticut sun. The fountain in the center of the lawn moved more slowly now, its water catching the cold light in trembling flashes. From the upstairs hallway, the estate looked almost untouched by sorrow. But inside the family sitting room, sorrow still lived quietly in the corners. It was Lily's birthday. If she had lived, she would have turned 7. Richard Whitmore had been awake since before dawn. He stood by the study window in shirt sleeves, looking out at the garden with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. The calendar on his desk said November 14, but he had not needed the date to tell him what kind of day it was. His body had known before he opened his eyes. There were dates grief never let a person forget. Across the hall, Evelyn had not yet come downstairs. That worried him, not because he expected her to fall apart in the loud, dramatic way strangers imagined heartbreak should look. Evelyn had never been dramatic. Her pain was quieter than that. More dangerous. In some ways, it folded inward. It vanished behind stillness. It turned silence into a hiding place. And today, of all days, he feared that silence might call her back. A soft knock sounded behind him. Maria Brooks stepped into the study doorway. "Good morning, sir." Richard turned. "Morning, Maria." Her expression was cautious, sympathetic. She knew what the day was. The entire house did. Even the kitchen had adjusted itself around the date. No bright music from the radio. No unnecessary chatter. The cook had prepared cinnamon rolls because Lily had once declared birthdays should begin with frosting. "Annie's up," Maria said. "She's getting dressed." Richard nodded slowly. "How is she?" Maria understood at once that he wasn't asking about Annie. "She's awake," Maria said quietly. "I took tea to her room. She thanked me." Richard lowered his eyes for a moment. That alone felt significant. A year ago, Evelyn would not even have answered the door. Did she say anything else? Maria hesitated. "Only that she'd like a few minutes alone." He nodded. "Of course." Maria lingered a moment longer. "She's stronger than she knows," she said. Richard gave a faint, tired smile. "I hope so." When Maria left, the study became quiet again. Richard set the coffee down and ran a hand across his jaw. There was no board meeting he could hide inside today. No conference call he could pretend mattered more than the ache in his own house. He had cleared his calendar 3 days earlier. His assistant had sounded surprised. Richard Whitmore did not cancel things, but grief was not a thing to schedule around. Upstairs, Annie Brooks sat cross-legged on the guest bed, frowning deeply at a sheet of yellow construction paper. "What are you doing?" Maria asked as she re-entered the room. "Thinking. That usually means trouble." Annie ignored that. "Do you think Mrs. Whitmore likes crowns or cards better?" Maria leaned against the doorframe. "What kind of crown?" "A birthday one." Maria's face softened. "For who?" Annie looked up as though the answer were obvious. "For both of them." Maria crossed the room and sat beside her daughter. "Both?" "Lily and Mrs. Whitmore," Annie said. "Because one is having a birthday in heaven, and one is still here and sad." The simple logic of childhood nearly undid Maria on the spot. Instead, she smoothed Annie's hair back and said, "That's a very big thought for 6 in the morning." Annie shrugged. "I woke up with it." By the time they came downstairs, the mansion was fully awake. The smell of cinnamon and coffee drifted through the lower hall. Sunlight spilled across the marble floor. But nobody moved quickly. Even the staff seemed to sense that today needed gentleness. Evelyn appeared at the top of the staircase just as Annie reached the bottom. Richard saw her first. For a second, he could not speak. She wore a soft cream sweater and dark slacks. simple clothes. But she had done something she had not done in a year. She had brushed her hair carefully and tied it back with a yellow ribbon, Lily's favorite color. Annie looked up and gasped. "You look beautiful." The compliment was so immediate and sincere that Evelyn nearly lost her balance under it. She gripped the railing lightly and managed a quiet, "Thank you." Richard moved toward the stairs without even realizing he had done it. "You don't have to do anything today," he said when she reached the last step. "We can keep it quiet. No one will ask anything of you." Evelyn looked at him, then at Annie, who was still clutching the yellow construction paper to her chest. "I know," she said, and then, after a pause that seemed to steady something inside her, she added, "I want to." Richard studied her face. The grief was still there, how could it not be? But beneath it, he saw something else too. Resolve. Not perfect, not fearless, but real. Breakfast was set in the smaller morning room rather than the formal dining room. That had once been Evelyn's preference, back when Lily had been well enough to wander the garden afterward with icing still on her fingers. The room overlooked the eastern lawn, and this morning the frost still clung to the grass like glass. Annie climbed into her chair and immediately set her paper in front of Evelyn. "I made something." Evelyn unfolded it slowly. It was not, strictly speaking, a card. Annie had cut the paper into a shape that might have been a heart, or might have been a pumpkin with feelings. Across the front, in large, uneven letters, she had written, "Happy birthday, Lily," and also, "Be kind to her mom today." Richard looked down at his plate and bit the inside of his cheek. Maria turned away under the pretense of adjusting the coffee tray. Evelyn held the paper with both hands. Her throat moved. For one terrifying second, Richard thought she might break under the sweetness of it. Instead, she laughed softly through tears. "That's very direct." Annie nodded proudly. "I didn't want heaven to get confused." Evelyn pressed the paper gently against her chest. "Thank you." Annie buttered a cinnamon roll and looked up again. "Are we doing something for Lily?" The room quieted. Richard set his coffee down carefully. "We usually visit the chapel in the garden," he said. The Whitmores had built the small stone chapel years before, more out of tradition than devotion. But after Lily died, Evelyn had gone there once every week for the first month, until silence became easier than prayer. Annie considered this. "Can I come?" Maria opened her mouth to say no. Richard glanced at Evelyn instead. Evelyn looked out the window toward the garden path that led to the chapel. It was lined with bare rose bushes and winter ivy. The stone walkway dusted in frost. She had not walked that path in months. Then she looked at Annie. "Yes," she said. Maria exhaled quietly. After breakfast, the four of them crossed the back lawn together. Richard walked beside Evelyn, not touching her but near enough that she would not have to reach far if she needed him. Annie skipped ahead, then remembered the day and slowed herself down. Maria followed a few steps behind, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. The chapel stood near the far edge of the gardens beneath two old maple trees. It was small, built of gray stone, with narrow windows and a wooden door that always stuck a little in damp weather. Inside were 6 pews, a simple altar, and a vase of fresh flowers someone from the staff had already placed there that morning. Yellow tulips. Evelyn stopped at the sight of them. "Who did that?" she whispered. Richard glanced toward Maria, who looked mildly guilty. "Annie may have made suggestions," Maria said. "I said tulips were important," Annie corrected. Evelyn smiled sadly. They sat in silence for a while after that. The kind of silence that belonged to memory, not emptiness. Annie swung her legs once, then stopped when Maria gave her a look. Finally, Evelyn rose and walked slowly to the front of the chapel. Richard stood too, instinctively, but did not approach. Evelyn turned to face the small room. Her hands were trembling. Her eyes were full. Yet when she spoke, her voice did not disappear. "On her last birthday," she said, Lily asked if 7 was old enough to wear lipstick. Richard let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. Annie's eyes widened. "Was it?" Evelyn shook her head. She said that was unfair. A tear slid down her cheek, but she did not stop. She wanted yellow balloons. Not pale yellow. Real yellow. She said pale yellow looked nervous. Richard bowed his head. Maria pressed a hand over her heart. Evelyn's voice grew steadier as she continued. She was brave, and funny, and impatient. And she loved badly drawn pictures if someone she loved made them. Annie smiled at that. Evelyn looked at the tulips. then at the ribbon in her hair. "I thought if I stayed silent, I was staying with her," she said. "But I wasn't. I was only burying myself beside her." The room went utterly still. Richard lifted his eyes. Evelyn turned then, and found Annie watching her with tears balanced in those serious little eyes. "This child," Evelyn said softly, "did not let me disappear." Annie looked down, suddenly shy. Richard could not speak. Maria could not either. And in the little stone chapel, on the day their daughter should have turned 7, Evelyn Whitmore stood in the open light of memory and grief and chose, at last, to remain among the living. The Whitmore mansion felt different after the visit to the chapel, not suddenly joyful. Grief did not disappear like fog under sunlight, but the weight of it had shifted. For the first time in a long while, the house felt like it was breathing again. Late afternoon light drifted across the gardens as the 4 of them walked back along the stone path. Annie held Maria's hand, though she kept glancing up at Evelyn every few seconds as if checking to make sure the woman was still there. Evelyn noticed. "You keep looking at me," she said gently. Annie nodded. "I'm making sure." "Making sure of what?" "That you didn't disappear again." Evelyn stopped walking for a moment. The honesty of children was sometimes sharper than any adult truth. "I won't," she said softly. Annie studied her carefully. "Promise?" Evelyn bent slightly so they were eye to eye. "I promise to try." Annie accepted that. "That's okay," she said. "Trying counts." Richard walked beside them in silence, listening to the exchange. His chest felt tight again, but not with the suffocating weight that had lived there all year. This was something else. Hope. Back inside the mansion, the staff moved quietly through the halls as evening settled in. The fireplace in the sitting room had already been lit, and the warm glow spilled across the polished wood floors. Maria guided Annie toward the kitchen. "You've had a big day," she said. "I'm not tired." "You're always not tired." Annie glanced over her shoulder. "Can Mrs. Whitmore come draw with us later?" Maria looked toward Evelyn. "That depends on Mrs. Whitmore." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I think I'd like that." Annie's face lit up like the sun had suddenly moved indoors. "Okay." Maria shook her head with quiet amusement and led Annie away. Soon the house settled into a calm evening rhythm. The kitchen hummed softly with dinner preparations. The gardeners finished their work and closed the iron gate near the fountain. Upstairs, the piano room stood open to the fading light. Evelyn walked there alone. She paused at the doorway before entering. For months, this room had felt like a museum of memories, too quiet, too full of echoes. Now it felt different, not healed, but welcoming. She stepped inside. The piano waited exactly where it always had. The yellow ribbon still hung loosely from the music stand. Lily's ribbon. Evelyn touched it lightly. "I miss you," she whispered. The words came easier now, not because the pain had lessened, because she was no longer afraid of it. Behind her, Richard appeared quietly in the doorway. "I thought you might come here." She turned slightly. "I used to hide from this room." He stepped inside. We both did. They sat together on the piano bench, neither speaking for a moment. Finally, Richard said, "My mother won't come back for a while." Evelyn gave a small breath of amusement. "I noticed. She's from a different world." Evelyn looked at him. "So were we." Richard nodded slowly. "Yes." He looked down at the piano keys. "I used to think success meant control," he said. "Control of business, money, reputation. And now?" Richard ran his fingers across the closed lid of the piano. "Now I think it means knowing what matters." Evelyn followed his gaze toward the garden outside. "Annie matters." "Yes." Richard smiled faintly. "She changed everything." Evelyn leaned back slightly. "Children do that." Richard looked at her carefully. "I've been thinking about something." Evelyn waited. "I don't want Annie to feel like a guest here." Evelyn turned to him. "What do you mean?" "I mean she should feel like she belongs." The word lingered in the air. Belongs. Evelyn understood immediately. The idea didn't feel strange. It felt right. "She already does," she said quietly. Richard's expression softened. "Then we should make sure she knows it." Downstairs, Annie's laughter echoed from the kitchen again. Maria's voice followed. "Annie Brooks, stop climbing the counter." "I'm not climbing," Annie protested. "I'm improving my view." Evelyn laughed. Richard smiled. For months, laughter had sounded almost disrespectful inside this house. Now it sounded like life returning. Evelyn reached out and pressed a single piano key. The note filled the room gently, then another, and another. This time the melody came clearer. Simple, slow, but real. Richard listened. That's Lily's song. Evelyn nodded. She never finished learning it. He looked at her. You will. Evelyn continued playing softly. Yes, she said. Outside the windows, evening settled over the Whitmore estate. The fountain rippled under the garden lights. The chapel stood quiet beneath the maple trees. Inside the house, a woman who had once lost her voice played a melody again, and somewhere in the kitchen, a 6-year-old girl with crayons in her backpack was busy explaining to the chef why badly drawn pictures were actually the most important kind. Winter came quietly to the Whitmore estate. The gardens lost their last leaves, the roses slept beneath frost, and the fountain moved slowly under the cold December air. The great mansion stood warm against the gray sky, its windows glowing softly at dusk like lanterns across the snow-dusted lawn. But inside, something had changed forever. Life had returned. On a quiet afternoon, 3 weeks after Lily's birthday, the sunroom was once again filled with the sound of crayons scratching across paper. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by drawings that looked like colorful explosions. None of the houses were straight. The sun still looked like a potato. The trees were far too large for the yard, and Annie was very proud of every one of them. This one is the best so far, she declared. Evelyn leaned forward to study the paper. It showed a large garden, a crooked fountain, 3 people standing under a giant yellow sun. What makes it the best? Evelyn asked. Annie pointed carefully. That's you. A stick figure with messy hair. That's Mr. Whitmore. A taller stick figure wearing something that looked suspiciously like a crown. And that's me. The smallest figure stood between them holding a balloon that floated far above the drawing. Evelyn smiled softly. I see. Annie tilted her head. Do you like it? Evelyn looked at the drawing for a long moment. I do. Annie beamed. Good. Because I already hung it on the refrigerator. Maria called from the kitchen. I heard that. Annie giggled. From the hallway, Richard Whitmore paused and leaned against the doorframe. He had learned not to interrupt these moments. For months, silence had ruled this house. Now it was filled with life again. Evelyn noticed him and gestured toward the floor. Come look. Richard walked in slowly and crouched beside the drawing. Well, he said thoughtfully, this is clearly the most accurate portrait ever created. Annie nodded proudly. I worked very hard. Richard pointed at the balloon. What's that? Annie answered immediately. That's Lily. The room became still, but not painfully still, just quiet. Evelyn looked down at the balloon drawn above their heads. Why the balloon? She asked gently. Annie thought for a moment. Because balloons float, she said. And she can still see us. Evelyn's eyes filled slightly, but she smiled. I think she can. Richard rested a hand gently on Evelyn's shoulder. Outside the window, snow had begun falling lightly over the garden paths. After a moment, Annie jumped to her feet. I have another idea. Maria sighed from the kitchen. That sentence always worries me. Annie ran to the piano. We should play Lily's song. Evelyn froze slightly. For months, the melody had belonged only to memory. Now Annie sat proudly on the piano bench and pressed a random key. It sounded terrible. Evelyn laughed. That's not the song. I know, Annie said confidently. I'm warming up. Richard sat in the armchair nearby. Should we be afraid? Probably, Evelyn said. Annie scooted over on the bench. Come help. Evelyn hesitated only a moment before sitting beside her. Her fingers rested on the keys. Then, slowly, gently, she began playing. The melody flowed softly into the room. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Annie listened carefully, then added a note. It was the wrong note. Evelyn corrected it. Annie tried again. Still wrong. Richard chuckled quietly. You're improving. Improvement takes time. Annie replied with great seriousness. The music continued, and the house listened. The kitchen quieted. The staff paused in the hallway, because for the first time in a year, the Whitmore mansion sounded like a home again. After the song ended, Annie leaned back on the bench. I like that one. Evelyn closed the piano lid gently. So did Lily. Richard stood and walked to the window. Snow now covered the fountain in soft white. He turned back toward the room. Dinner in 10 minutes, he said. Maria added from the kitchen. And Annie Brooks is washing her hands first. Annie groaned dramatically. I already washed them this morning. Again, Maria replied. Annie slid off the bench and ran toward the kitchen. Fine. Her laughter echoed down the hallway. Evelyn watched her go. Then she looked at Richard. "She saved me." Richard shook his head gently. "No." He reached for her hand. "You came back." Evelyn squeezed his hand. Outside, the snow continued falling across the gardens. Inside, the Whitmore house was warm with light, music, and the sound of a child's laughter. And somewhere in the quiet sky above it all, a little girl named Lily floated like a bright yellow balloon, watching the family she loved learn how to live again. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from doctors, or time, or even courage. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a 6-year-old girl who refuses to let silence win. This story reminds us that healing does not always come from power, money, or even time. Sometimes it comes from the simplest acts of kindness. Evelyn believed that silence was the only way to stay close to her lost daughter. But Annie showed her that love does not disappear when we keep living. Through honesty, patience, and compassion, a child helped a grieving mother find her voice again. The lesson is simple but powerful. Kindness can reach places that strength cannot. And sometimes the smallest person in the room can bring the greatest change. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.